Good evening, thanks for joining us. We will begin with what could be the rumblings of yet another...
Those that make us grip our seats with excitement.
Major breaking news tonight. An explosive report.
And hoopla, it surely is.
There's a bunch going on tonight. A lot of news has broken in the last 24 hours, so let's get right to it.
A sample of the marvelous tricks you'll see for the price of a small thin dime. You get the whole show now if you hurry, hurry, hurry.
Hello everyone, I'm Anthony Rotolo, and this is The Circus, where we take a look at the biggest stories occupying center stage at that big top of broadcasting, that cavalcade of commentating clowns, the fake news freak show collectively known as the mainstream media. We're going to cover all the stories dominating our airwaves this week, some of their amazing acrobatics, and also a few stories that are out on the fringes of the carnival. Starting out this week, as we've started out most weeks since the election, is another Russia hysteria story.
The White House now says President Trump had a previously undisclosed second conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin on July 7th, the day of their 2 hour and 15 minute...
How many secret meetings do we have to learn about before we understand that it's not just that the meeting is not normal, the presidency is not normal?
You know, this time it's almost hard to even be annoyed at the story. It's almost comical how we rolled into this week with the national papers and the mainstream news networks really just going on and on and on nonstop with this big, bold headline story that President Trump at the G20 summit in Germany had not one, but two meetings with Russian President Vladimir Putin, with the second being a secret that nobody knew about. This, of course, the screaming Democrats tell us, is proof that not only is Donald Trump colluding with the Russians, but he is the wholly owned puppet of the Russian president. But there's one major problem with this story. I mean, that would all be true if Trump really snuck away during the G20 to have a chat with Vladimir Putin all by himself. You know, what's even worse, according to the critics, is that there wasn't an American present with the president in order to listen to what's going on, in order to, you know, they're implying that the president isn't smart enough, isn't capable enough to have a conversation with another world leader, with his counterpart from Russia. So there wasn't an American translator, an American diplomat with him for this secret meeting. So we not only have no idea what they talked about, and most likely it was some sort of nefarious world domination scheme, but we don't even know if the conversation that they had was accurate because only Putin's translator was there, giving Putin what Trump was saying in English back in Russian. So maybe they deceived Trump altogether. But like I said, there's a big problem with this story. The story is that this was not a secret meeting taking place in the shadows of the G20. This was at a big banquet dinner that all of the leaders were invited to, that Angela Merkel was hosting, the Chancellor of Germany was hosting, of course, because it was her home country that had the G20. And at one section of the table, Vladimir Putin was seated next to Melania Trump, our First Lady, who really made her first entry into diplomacy as an actor in diplomacy during that conversation, really, because if you put yourself in Melania's shoes, imagine what topics are going to come up. Imagine what you would say to Vladimir Putin if you were seated at such a high-level event next to him as the American within speaking distance of Mr. Putin. So certainly Melania was briefed in working with the State Department and also showing off her skills on the world stage as a diplomat. But further down the table, we had Donald Trump, and he was seated next to the Japanese Prime Minister's wife, Mrs. Abe. And so Trump had with him a translator that speaks Japanese, naturally, because his dinner partner is the Japanese First Lady, in essence, the wife of the Japanese Prime Minister. And so naturally, Trump is going to want to be able to converse in Japanese, and everyone only brings one translator. So at some point during the dinner, President Trump gets up and is mingling around the room, talking to different world leaders, and at some point stops and has a conversation with his counterpart here at the dinner table in front of the leaders of 20 of the world's most powerful economies. And this is the meeting that was supposed to be the big top secret Nobody's supposed to know about it. The media wasn't told. Meeting between these two leaders. And yet, the media was there. The media has photos of this dinner. There's video of Donald Trump walking around, talking to different world leaders, talking to Vladimir Putin. So this notion that there was some sort of secret second meeting that the press didn't know about is really just ridiculous on its face. But that doesn't stop anybody. You see, with this Russia story that's dominating the news, especially if you watch CNN or MSNBC, this is the story of the century. In their minds, this is the biggest news story we will ever live through. The Russians must have, mind you, there's no proof yet presented, but the Russians must have directly manipulated Donald Trump, either blackmailed him or that he willingly worked with them, but manipulated Donald Trump and stole our election to install Vladimir Putin's puppet in the White House. That is what the narrative is on these networks. And so proof doesn't really make a difference. It's just the appearance of proof that makes the difference. Because we're really at a level now with the Red Scare, with this Russian hysteria that's going on that we haven't seen since the McCarthy era of the 1950s, where ironically people on the left, liberal folks in America, were being rounded up for questioning just because somebody suggested or accused them of being associated with communists, of being associated often with Russian communists, hence the name Red Scare. So we're at that point, maybe almost going beyond it, because we now have a party, or at least a huge portion of the Democratic Party, that is playing into this McCarthyism in a way that was not universally accepted on either the left or the right in the past, in the McCarthy era. And not only that, but the mainstream media seems to not only support this idea, this narrative of Russian collusion and conspiracy, but they want it to be true. They want to prove it to be true. And so we get to a place where you have elected officials, elected representatives in the federal government, people like Tim Kaine, who was running to be our vice president, saying things like a simple meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and a Russian lawyer where no information was exchanged is tantamount to treason.
Do you think this is treason?
That the investigation, it's not, nothing is proven yet, but we're now beyond obstruction of justice in terms of what's being investigated. This is moving into perjury, false statements, and even into potentially treason.
Now, whether Donald Trump Jr. knew that he was going to get information from the Russian government in that meeting, or thought he knew, or wanted information from the Russian government, that's a thought crime, keep in mind, because he didn't actually get that information from the Russian government, regardless of what his intentions were. And, you know, it may sound naive to say this, but for all we know, had this Russian lawyer presented him with information from Vladimir Putin or the Russian government, we don't know what he would have done with it, whether he would have turned it in to the FBI, whether he would have made a big deal out of it, or whether he would have gone ahead and, as they say, colluded with that information to use it against Hillary Clinton. We really don't know. And maybe it's naive to think that Donald Trump Jr. would have done the right thing, but I'm just saying, let's keep in mind that we don't know what would have happened, because the crime, or the alleged crime, did not actually happen. But nonetheless, according to people like Tim Kaine, this is tantamount to treason. And, you know, we got to step back for a minute and remember that treason is a crime that has very rarely been punished in America, but is a capital crime, meaning if Donald Trump Jr. meeting with this Russian lawyer who doesn't give him any information is approaching treason, or is treason, then Donald Trump Jr. should be killed for having a meeting with a Russian. And the story continues to become more hysterical as we find out that there were other Russians at this meeting. Other Russians.
Just in, NBC News has learned there was someone else in that meeting between Donald Trump Jr., senior advisor Jared Kushner, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, and a Russian lawyer. Also in that June 9th meeting at Trump Tower, another person with alleged ties to Moscow.
We're following breaking news at this moment, and breaking news involving a meeting in Trump Tower involving Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and campaign chairman at the time, Paul
revealed,
Manafort. We're now
a
learning
well-known Russian-American lobbyist who lives here in Washington, D.C., told the Associated Press that he was in the room on behalf of the Russian attorney.
Lots of Russians together in a room, it must be a bad thing. And yet, if you dig deep into these stories coming from the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN, you see that these other people that are being described are American citizens who have not been Russian citizens in a very long time and who came to America and sought citizenship to be part of our country, to be an American. And so, keeping in mind that we have no idea what the motivations are of these folks, which is fine to investigate if we think that something really nefarious did actually happen with the Russian involvement in the election, this time different than every other election that they try to meddle in. But if we really think something nefarious happened, look into it, sure. Look into what the intentions were of these Russian nationals or folks who may have ties to Russia meeting with the Trump campaign, fine. But what happens in the media is we get this hysteria, and not only the media, but in Congress, we get this hysteria talking about Russians. There were Russians there, when they're really talking about Americans, which is really disturbing and ironic, actually, when you think about it, considering the criticism that comes from the left to the right. Anytime there is a discussion of, say, an Islamic extremist committing a crime, and reporting that is somehow a way of attacking or villainizing Islamic extremists. That's their logic on it, that we shouldn't talk about or we shouldn't report about those kinds of stories because it makes people think that all Muslims are bad. Now, really, any logical adult in mainstream society knows that it's not true that all Muslims are bad people. In fact, most people agree that the vast majority of Muslims, not only in America but in the world, would not commit an act of terrorism, regardless of what they think, regardless of how ideologically similar or how religiously similar they are to the people committing the terrorism. There's a difference between having beliefs and committing an act. And I think most people agree that regardless of whether a Muslim person is moderate or very conservative in their beliefs or very liberal in their religious beliefs, a vast majority of them would not kill other people because of that. Nonetheless, the left makes these criticisms that we should not talk about Islamic extremism because it's going to somehow put in danger or mistreat Muslim Americans by associating them with these terrible things that happen. But interestingly enough, in the Russian story and the desperation to tie Donald Trump in some way to Russia, not only just, as he says, to explain why Hillary Clinton lost, which is really embarrassing to the Democratic Party when you think about it. The president himself acknowledges that she should have beat him in the election. As much as he loves winning and talks about how much he loves winning, it's amazing how many times in public he has said that he can't believe he won and the Democrats should have won.
I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won. And the reason they should have won it is the Electoral College is almost impossible for a Republican to win. It's very hard because you start off at such a disadvantage. So everybody was thinking they should have won the election. This was an excuse for having lost an election.
So they want to explain that, but there's more to it as well. Now that she has lost, now that Donald Trump is in office and is much more effective than they had anticipated, and then that the media lets on, really expanded his appeal within the Republican Party, but also reinforced it with those who put him into office. Well, you see, the Democratic Party is desperate to get him out of office. Now.
Last week, you said your greatest desire is to lead Donald Trump right into impeachment. I'm wondering why is it appropriate to call for the impeachment of the president less than a month after him taking office?
I have not called for the impeachment yet. He's doing it himself. What are we going to do? How can a president who is acting in the manner that he's acting, whether he's talking about the travel ban, the way that he's targeting Muslims, or whether he's talking about his relationship to Putin and the Kremlin, and knowing that they have hacked, and the fact that he is wrapping his arms around Putin while Putin is continuing to advance into Korea, I think that he is leading himself into that kind of position where folks will begin to ask, what are we going to do? And the answer is going to be, eventually, we've got to do something about him.
I'm not here to talk about impeachment today. Any of the things that the congressman said are grounds for displeasure and unease in the public about the performance of this president, who has acted in a way that is strategically incoherent, that is incompetent, and that is reckless.
They need him to be out of office not by beating him in the next election in 2020, because they know that that's a long shot, actually. It's not the common wisdom. Everyone just sort of assumes because of the negative reporting. The common wisdom is that Donald Trump has no chance of being reelected. But remember, that's what they were saying before this election. Now he's been in office, and in 4 years is going to have a track record to talk of. Controversial, perhaps, not popular with everyone, perhaps, but he's been president. And it's awfully difficult to beat a sitting president. It doesn't happen that often to begin with. But also Donald Trump has an appeal that not only do they not want to admit, but is growing. And so they need to get him out of office before 2020 so that they can run against a weakened Republican Party, a weakened, most likely, President Pence if Donald Trump were impeached, a weakened President Pence who they hope they can beat in the next election because people will be looking for stability, a familiar face, a party not in chaos. They're looking for a post-Nixon Watergate scenario where you have this very weak Vice President Gerald Ford running for office, and the Democrats are able to come in and beat him with a candidate that never should have been president to begin with, but a candidate that really would not have had a great shot otherwise. So that's really what the agenda is on the left here with the story, and so that's why proof doesn't matter too much, and that's why you get this incredible hyperbole coming from even elected officials, people like Mike Quigley, a congressman from Illinois, actually going on television and saying that we have to realize when you're meeting with any Russian, this is a quote now, you're meeting with Russian intelligence and therefore President Putin.
I think you're seeing a clear pattern of people in the Trump campaign coordinating with Russians. And I think what we're learning with the Trump Jr. meeting is when you meet with any Russians, you're meeting with Russian intelligence and therefore President Putin. The fact of the matter is, once they do this, they become subject, in my mind, of the investigation.
We have a congressman on television, a Democratic congressman from Illinois, Mike Quigley, on television actually saying that any Russian you meet with, you have to think when you meet with that Russian, when you talk to that Russian, when you say hi on the street to that Russian, you're waving hello to Vladimir Putin, which sounds a lot like xenophobia to me. It sounds a lot like hate speech to me. It's wrong. It's not American to say that anybody from Russia or anybody who knows anybody from Russia might be compromised by the Soviets, by the communists, by I don't know what, by Russia, this terrible place that's trying to hurt us. And make no mistake, Russia's not our friend, but it's not an active threat, and the people of Russia are not trying to hurt us. So circling back to this headline now, that's why you get these stories like top secret meeting on the sidelines of G20. Trump meets with Putin a second time, insinuating it's away from the cameras, away from the really great meeting that they actually had, the scheduled meeting that ran, what was it, 2 hours or something like that? It was supposed to be a half hour. I mean, they agreed to a ceasefire in Syria in this meeting. And this was no joke. It was a real meeting between presidents where something happened.
Now, you said I was an expert. I actually do have one expertise. I've seen a lot of summits, as we call meetings between American and Russian presidents. Was present at some, even participated in the first George Bush's summit preparation when he met with Gorbachev in Malta. He invited me to Camp David to debate before his team. In that context, I think what we saw today was potentially the most fateful meeting between an American and Russian president since the wartime. The reason is that the relationship with Russia is so dangerous And yet we have a president who might have been crippled or cowed by these Russiagate attacks on him, and yet he was not. He was, I think, politically courageous. It went well. They did important things, and this will be astonishing to be said, I know, but I think maybe today we witnessed President Trump emerging as an American statesman. I think it was a very good day for everybody.
And they did talk about the Russians hacking the election. I laugh when you hear the criticism that, you know, Trump says that he talked to him about it, but nothing happened. He didn't do anything. He didn't stand up to Putin. I laugh because I think, what exactly did they want him to do in that meeting? You're going to say to the Russian president, hey, you tried to mess around with our elections, cut it out, which, by the way, President Obama said to Putin as well. He's not going to do it, and he's not going to admit to it. So I'm not sure if they were expecting Trump to take down Putin like that WWE CNN meme, you know, just start pounding him right there in the G20 or what. But apparently he didn't stand up to him. So they had this secret meeting. And that's where these headlines come from. The implication is really that there's something more going on here, and therefore an excuse to keep reporting about it. If you really want evidence that that's the strategy, look no further than the Queen herself, Rachel Maddow, who had us all tune in a few months ago with this big tease of Donald Trump's tax returns being released from 2005. She had 2 pages of the document that showed nothing but the fact that he paid a lot of taxes and made a lot of money. But she went on to present all of these open-ended conspiracy questions, things that might have been or may be or could be or maybe should be looked at, and actually outright said she was doing this story to give other reporters ideas and reasons to continue to report on this Russian collusion story. She said it was material seed for future reporting. And that's really what they're doing. So that's why, once again, we started this week off with more Russia hysteria. Even though it was supposed to be Made in America week for the White House, the big story that ended up playing out in the media this week about President Trump was not about Made in America, but it was about an interview that he gave to the New York Times, the failing New York Times, as he calls it, that he invited. And this is the thing about Trump. Before we get into this interview that deserved reporting, serious reporting, here's the thing about Donald Trump. For as much as he bashes the media, for as much as he calls it the failing New York Times, for example, other than CNN, he still works with these publications and with these news outlets. He invited the New York Times to the Oval Office to do this interview. And they did a legitimate interview. The president was asked by New York Times reporters about his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, which, speaking of Russia, Jeff Sessions' most notable act as Attorney General so far has been to basically take himself out of the responsibility of the Attorney General for the most important FBI investigation going on right now. That is the Russia investigation that could interfere with the administration for which Sessions works. He recused himself from that because the Democrats, again in another one of these hysteria stories, brought up this claim that Jeff Sessions had been meeting with the Russian ambassador about something that had to do with meddling in the election. And even though nobody bought that, even though nobody thought that Jeff Sessions, in these 2 encounters he had with the Russian ambassador, one of them, again, was in a room with tons of other people at an event where they were socializing. But because nobody bought that, it makes it hard to understand why Jeff Sessions went ahead and recused himself as Attorney General from overseeing anything to do with the Russia investigation. So the New York Times asks Trump about Jeff Sessions and how he feels about that. And Trump, being Trump, honestly answered the question.
Sessions gets the job. Right after he gets the job, he recuses himself.
Was that a mistake?
Well, Sessions should have never recused himself. And if he was going to recuse himself, he should have told me before he took the job, and I would have picked somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
He gave you no heads up at all in any sense?
Zero.
Okay.
So Jeff Sessions takes the job, gets into the job, recuses himself. I then have, which frankly, I think is very unfair to the president. How do you take a job and then recuse yourself? If he would have recused himself before the job, I would have said, thanks, Jeff, but I can't, I'm not going to take you.
You see, this is the thing that gets everybody going about the president and the things that he says. You hear this all the time, the things he says, the things he tweets, and so on. The thing about this president is that he says what's on his mind. He speaks the truth. It may not be the truth in terms of the right answer in your mind or my mind or anyone else's mind, but in his mind, it is the true answer. It is the answer he's thinking, not the one he knows he's supposed to give. So that's what I mean when I say he speaks the truth. It's really what he's thinking. And Trump told the New York Times that if he had known that Jeff Sessions was going to recuse himself, he would have picked somebody else. And, this is a remarkable thing for a president to say. It is not common for a sitting president to say something negative about one of their cabinet members and then continue to have them serve in that administration. The reason being because when anyone deals with Jeff Sessions from here on out as Attorney General, there may be an influence in that whoever Jeff Sessions is working with has in their mind that this person doesn't have the president's support. And so that may affect somehow Jeff Sessions' ability to do his job, or at least that's the logic. So presidents have often refrained from saying things that would cast that kind of light on one of their cabinet officials. But in this case, the president goes ahead and says what he really thinks, that he would have picked somebody else if he knew that Jeff Sessions was going to decide he had to recuse himself for the Russia thing. Now, why does he think that? Why does the president feel that he should have picked somebody else? Well, first and foremost, keep in mind that the president, and presumably Jeff Sessions and everyone else working around the president, believes that the Russia investigation is nothing more than a witch hunt. That's not just what they're saying. He believes it was a witch hunt because if you put yourself in his shoes for a moment, and let's just say that he didn't actually work hand in hand with Vladimir Putin to win the election, well, he knows or assumes they're going to find nothing in his circle related to ties to Russia. And therefore, the idea that Jeff Sessions would recuse himself from this, when the president believes that nothing happened, that there's nothing to investigate, but Jeff Sessions recuses himself and therefore can't oversee how the investigation goes, it basically leaves a big door open to the opposition to come in and attack him from really all different directions by using the Russia story as an excuse. So naturally, you would want an ally as your attorney general. The attorney general does work for the administration, and particularly if that attorney general knows the truth about what happened with Russia, you would want them to exercise the truth, or exercise their knowledge of the truth anyway, in how that investigation is handled. To approach it rationally, to not take down your administration. And, yes, that's political, but it's also real. It's realistic. Let's face it. Any president, Barack Obama or otherwise, Bill Clinton, anybody would want their attorney general to act in a way that they believe to be truthful and right and just. And so the speculation swirls now. Is Jeff Sessions out? Well, he says no. He says he plans to continue to serve, and I'm sure he will. But it's valid speculation. In this case, you have the media reporting something that is legitimate political news. Because Jeff Sessions was one of the president's earliest supporters, one of his earliest legitimate supporters anyway, one of the first politicians willing to side with Donald Trump in running for the nomination of the Republican Party. He's been an ardent supporter. He's been pushing things like the border wall and immigration reform and law and order policies in Congress for a very long time, long before Trump was on the scene doing that. And he's been relatively focused on that as Attorney General, except for having a total inability to affect or limit in any way this unruly beast of a Russia, quote-unquote, investigation, which at this point in time, if any other Attorney General were in office, they would be actively involved in what was going on with the Russia investigation. It would be the most important thing on their agenda for that day, week, month, year, however long that investigation goes. Because it's dealing with the president, it's the top story in a lot of the mainstream media. But Jeff Sessions can't do anything with that. He can't know anything about that. So, of course, he's been focused on the other things that he's interested in. And those, if you're a supporter of the president, that's a good thing. Those are good things. So we don't know. Maybe Jeff Sessions will be out eventually, soon enough. Maybe Jeff Sessions will take the fall for the Russia investigation. Who knows? It's unfortunate because Jeff Sessions is a loyal member, it seems, of the cabinet. Donald Trump works well with loyal people. We know he values loyalty. But in this case, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe the Attorney General should be at least aware of what's going on with this Russia special investigation. and not be somebody who is compromised and can't even look at it, can't even know about it. But this New York Times interview had some other headlines too, and some other criticism. This questioning of why would the president do this interview? Not just why would he say what he said. We know the answer to that. He's Trump, and that's what he does. But why would he do this interview and then say something that would step on his message of Made in America Week? You hear that a lot in the media, this idea that the president has stepped on his message. And so now all the news has to be about this other story. It has to be about Jeff Sessions, or has to be about Russia because he tweeted something about Russia, so on and so forth. And I just want to take a look at that idea for a minute. Consider that you have folks in the media whose job it is to do the reporting as news, that the president has stepped on his media narrative, and therefore they will now report about something else. The implication is that they would love to talk about healthcare and jobs and the economy and infrastructure and tax reform and all the things that the American public wants to hear about. They would love to talk about that all day. But the president just tweeted something about Russia, and so that requires us, almost like they have no say in it, that requires us now to report about unproven Russia information and speculation and sensationalism for a full 24-hour cycle or more. This is the equivalent of saying, we're the people who decide what goes on the air or what goes into print. And we know that there's important information out there you want to know. But like a dog seeing a squirrel, the president tweeted something or said something in an interview that was controversial. And now we can't report about any of that other stuff. We can only report about that one thing. That is now the only story. And of course, that's how cable news works. If there's a story that a particular network thinks is big enough, and often, they all align when it's a major event. Lately, it's been MSNBC and CNN aligning about various Russia revelations, and Fox News kind of going their own way and dipping in occasionally to poke fun at the other networks for reporting that Russia stuff. But when a network decides that something is a big enough story that they really want to push, it becomes the only story. That's what they say to each other. That's the only story right now. And so nothing else can be reported, almost as if they have no ability to break away and talk about anything else. So this criticism that the president continuously steps on his own agenda, his own narrative, his own positive news by having other things happen in the world, like a thought on Russia, a thought on a celebrity, a Rosie O'Donnell, or so on, that suddenly that needs to be the only story, is just ludicrous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it is bizarre, even, that they would make this claim, because it almost cedes all of the responsibility in deciding what is news to the president. The president gets to decide what the news is, and he's used that to great advantage. He is a master media manipulator. The election proved that. And so here in this criticism that the president steps on his news narrative, and therefore they have to report about this other nonsense, is just evidence that the president's driving what's in the press. Speaking of Rosie O'Donnell, I want to say that I've been picking on the liberal bias of the mainstream media, which is predominant. But of course, there is other bias in other media. And Rosie O'Donnell showed up in a favorite story on the right this week.
America's loudest Trump-hating liberal is now encouraging her Twitter followers to play a sick online game to harm the president. It allows players to push a virtual version of Mr. Trump off a cliff.
Well, I don't think it helps at all. I think it's offensive. So, you go back to Kathy Griffin, Lisa, I just think it's a little bit much.
Rosie O'Donnell, the headlines say, is advocating for her followers, meaning her social media followers, her audience, so on, to play a game online which allows you to kill the president. Sean Hannity covered this, a few others did on Fox. In other conservative media, there was certainly reference to it, linking it to things like Kathy Griffin and Madonna and other people who've said really violent or done really violent things with the image of the president.
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
But the thing is, if you want to fight fake news, if you want to fight the growing violent streak on the far left, don't create fake news of your own. Whether it's Sean Hannity or other people reporting this, There are plenty of examples. I mean, Hannity runs down a whole list of them all the time, and they're legitimate, real examples of a troubling, violent hysteria that's starting to grow in the left wing of politics in America. But this was not one of those examples. When you really look at this game that Rosie O'Donnell tweeted, it's an internet game, I guess you could call it, where you take this sort of like paper doll looking image cut out of the president and you walk him off a cliff or you drop him off other things. It's funny. It's a joke. That's a real joke, not like what Kathy Griffin did joke. There's a punchline to it. It's funny. It's not realistic in any way. And it's definitely not calling for violence against the president. I mean, Rosie O'Donnell has her own issues. She's totally off her rocker at this point. Who can blame her? I mean, I understand Rosie. I get it. I get why she's off her rocker. Put yourself in her shoes for a minute. Imagine if your arch rival, your nemesis, somebody you desperately hate, became the president. Imagine that. Just in your own life, picture the person, everybody has one, who's just been that thorn in your side, somebody that you can't stand, an ex-husband, an ex-girlfriend, something like that. And you always want to be doing better than them. You always want to look better than them. You always want to be happier than them. Imagine if they became president. Well, that's what happened to Rosie. You know, she was going over the cliff before. She really left Sanity Town quite a while ago. But, I mean, rock bottom is your arch nemesis becoming the president of the United States, isn't it? So here's an interesting story. In Minneapolis yesterday, you know, I actually got to see this one unfold in real time live, and it really was remarkable to see. In Minneapolis, there was a press conference from their mayor, Betsy Hodges, who was announcing the resignation of the police chief there in Minneapolis. And the reason for this resignation, you may have heard about this, an Australian woman there in Minneapolis was shot and killed after she called the police to report an assault or a rape that she thought was going on. And when the police pulled up, they actually shot and killed the Australian woman who had called them to report this potential crime. And so naturally there's been outrage in Minneapolis. And some have been saying, you know, where's the protesters for this? The Australian woman was the same scenario as, or similar scenario to these other cases that are protested, but she was white. Maybe that's why there's no outcry and so on. But the outcry did come, and it came during this press conference with the mayor. As she was preparing to announce the replacement for the police chief, protesters hijacked her press conference.
He has served as inspector for the 1st Precinct and a deputy chief and chief of staff.
We're asking for your prompt resignation. Listen, we don't want you as our mayor of Minneapolis anymore. We're asking that you take your staff with you. Listen, we don't want you to appoint anybody anymore. Your leadership has been very ineffective, and if you don't remove yourself, we're going to put somebody in place to remove you. We do not want you as the mayor of Minneapolis ever again. We would like you to move out of our city. Your police department has terrorized us enough. Your press conference is ineffective because you won't let the people in, and you didn't want to hear us, so you hear me now. We do not want you as the mayor of Minneapolis, and we're asking you to resign. We do not want you as the mayor. You have been ineffective. You are not a head coach.
So, I hear and understand, for folks who are listening, I hear and understand. I hear and understand your objections and the work that we've done.
This is our house. You can't lock us out of our house and hold a press conference so you can rubber stamp bullshit. We want you out of this office. We don't want you in the office.
What's going on? This is a tough time. This is a tough time around the world.
I mean, they started yelling and listing off their grievances. And, you know, the mayor who had the microphone and the podium was totally unable to sort of get any kind of order right away. And so, you know, after a few minutes of this, all hope is lost of this being a press conference again. Eventually, she's shuffled off by her security, presumably, or police. And the protesters take right over.
that we're not going to be tricked by this effort, right? The former chief wasn't doing her job, but we understand it's beyond the chief. That the problem is institutional. That's right. Right? If it was not institutional, then those cameras would have been, those body cameras would have been on the police the other day, right? But the problem is deeper than that, and we're here to say we're not going to be tricked. We don't want them to change clothes. We want them to change the institution, right?
Through this incident, we learned what some of us already knew, is that the body camera policy was screwed from the get-go. Back in 2015, some of us were pushing for a decent body camera policy.
What's interesting about this is that for the first time, this is not about race. There have been racially focused police brutality stories in Minneapolis and all around the country for some time. Minneapolis is where Philando Castile was killed, and the officer that killed him was acquitted. But in this case, you have a white woman, and you had groups coming together to demand that this stop, saying that Minneapolis has a real problem. And I have to say, they did a great job, because not only was this not about race, yes, race is included as an aspect, certainly. Certainly that can play into what happens in an encounter with police. I think we all know that on some level it can play in. But here, that's not what was being argued. What was being argued is that the way the police operate needs to be looked at. Reform needs to happen. Wholesale reform of policing in Minneapolis. And that the people were exercising their democratic right to speak out. And it wasn't violent. That's the other part. It was loud, and it was uncomfortable, and it was awkward, and it was tough to watch at times. But it was American. It was democracy. That's America. We are loud and awkward and uncomfortable and tough to watch sometimes. But that's America, to be able to speak up and make people uncomfortable. And that's what these folks were doing, and I really applaud them for that. They hijacked that press conference. They had prepared statements, a little chaotic certainly, but they corralled the press and everything they could do in order to capitalize on the fact that this was going to get on the news, and they did an excellent job.
Let me
get these press back.
No, not good. We have to be quiet.
The other interesting thing about this story from a media perspective is that it was covered by all the different networks with their different ideological spins, of course, because there's an undertone to this story that's really going unreported. You see, the officer that shot and killed the Australian woman, 2-year veteran of the Minneapolis police force, that officer's name was Mohammed Noor, and he was a Somali immigrant. And the mayor of Minneapolis has been pandering quite a bit, politically pandering, to the fairly large Somali immigrant population there in the Minneapolis area. And so, from the right, the interest in this story isn't just in the killing of the Australian woman. It's in the underreporting of the name of the officer and his identity, because on the left you have this bias of not wanting to talk about these incidents, but also because the right is subtly making the argument here, and in some cases not so subtly, depending on who you listen to, that it was the racially focused diversity policies of the left, of the mayor, of Minnesota, what have you, that put this officer in his job in the first place in order to enhance diversity, but not necessarily because he was a good fit for the police force. And this is an argument you hear a lot. And so they want to talk about this story in a way that they haven't wanted to talk about other police shootings on Fox News, for example.
The rumours were right. A female Time Lord or Time Lady is on her way.
But people already want to exterminate her. The BBC revealed the 13th incarnation of Doctor Who will be a woman played by Broadchurch actress Jodie Whittaker. I think it's a great idea, long overdue. Why shouldn't Doctor Who be female? A lot of people, though, very angry. Carl Atkins on Twitter. The Doctor is a husband and father in the storyline. It's a character with a history and a story, both of which are now ruined.
Ruined, I say.
And last but not least, in the entertainment world, we had in the news this week from the BBC about Doctor Who, the identity of the 13th Doctor. For the first time since the show premiered in 1963, that lead actor, that lead part is going to be played by a woman. And looking online anyway, you would think that the geek world came to an end when that was announced. When in reality, I'm not so sure that's the case. I mean, yes, there are people who are going to express their opinions about it. And let me just say, I think it is totally legitimate if you prefer your Doctor Who, to be a man. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If to you the Doctor is a male character and you prefer the show like that, and it somehow makes the show less appealing to you because the Doctor is portrayed by a woman actor, I think that's a legitimate opinion to have. I happen to disagree with it, but I think it's a legitimate opinion to have. And so this idea of labeling people who are having that opinion as sexist somehow, equating the idea that they prefer that the Doctor be a male, that the character continue to be played by a male, is the same thing as having the belief that a woman actor can't hold a lead part, or a woman actor is not equal to a man, or so on and so forth. It's a little bit of a stretch in my mind. It's something we see and hear all the time. But I think it is a valid opinion to have a preference. I mean, people have preferences about just about everything. I mean, and I've been asked a lot of times what I think of the Doctor now being a woman. Of course, because I taught a Doctor Who class to the world as an open online class when I was a professor. So a lot of folks know that I have an interest in Doctor Who, that I have had an involvement on some level in the topic, and are curious about my thoughts on it. And, well, I mean, I think it's just fine. The character of the Doctor is thousands of years old, right? And you know, the character has been on television in 12 other forms. Yes, male forms, but 12 other forms since 1963. So the fact that a woman is going to play the role is really, in my mind, not only inevitable. At some point, it's going to get boring to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. But, I mean, it really changes nothing about the essence of the show. Someone may disagree and feel that there's some reason that the Doctor should continue to be male. And like I said, that's valid. But in my view, in what I think is a studied view of Doctor Who, it really doesn't change anything about the show. And I mean, let's be honest, really nobody should be surprised by this change. I mean, if you are a fan and you've been watching, you know that they've been telegraphing this idea for a really long time. When Matt Smith made his first appearance, regenerating as the 11th Doctor, coming in from David Tennant's 10th Doctor, one of the first things he said when he felt his somewhat longer hair was that he thought he was a girl, acknowledging the fact that that could happen. Not only that, the Doctor's arch rival, the Master, who has also been doing battle with the Doctor since almost the beginning of the series, since John Pertwee's third Doctor in the 1970s, the Master recently returned as Missy, a woman. To some degree, that was a publicity stunt, yes, but I think the character of Missy, and really the performance of Michelle Gomez, has been an excellent part of recent episodes of Doctor Who. So, I mean, by all accounts, that went fairly well. And that's not even getting into your non-Doctor characters, people like River Song and so on, who are really big fan favorites, and clearly women. So this shift has been coming for a while. And then if you look at the broader sci-fi world, this almost requirement now that every franchise be fronted by a woman is out there, whether it's Rogue One or Force Awakens and Star Wars world, Star Trek Discovery coming out in a few months and having a woman captain. I mean, this is something that has been trending for some time, so it really shouldn't be a surprise.
What's happened?
Change, my dear. And it seems not a moment too soon.
And that's all the time we have for this installment of The Circus. We'll be back next time with another lineup of stories taking center stage. I'm Anthony Rotolo, and I'm watching the news, so you don't have to.